It's time to install the end graft now. It's called end trim or end graft, and you can be a little creative here in what you do. Most of the time I use a piece of hardwood in this area. But what we're doing is covering up the seam where the two sides come together and trying to do something a little decorative. Your strap pin, your end pin, is going to go in the center of this. What they've supplied with the kit is like a trapezoidal piece of plastic and two black-white purfling strips to go on the side of it. So once we cut a channel for it, we're going to be putting black and white strip on each side of it. What we need to do is set this in position. Once we cut out the channel for it, we can force it into that channel since it's shaped in a triangular shape. So you want most of your excess up here on top when you mark it, and you want it perfectly centered on the bottom because it's got to line up with that decorative strip on the back. It's going to look really bad if it's off to the side of that decorative strip. So you want to center it up about right there and center it on the top. Hold it in place, and what I'm doing is just using the fine lead mechanical pencil to mark on both sides of it very carefully. Then I'm going to take a metal straight edge and an X-Acto knife and score along there very carefully, being sure to keep the blade right up against the metal strip. I've also put a brand new blade in my X-Acto knife. So I'm going to do that off camera. Once we get those lines scored in there, then we'll come in with a chisel and start cleaning it out to a depth that's appropriate for this piece of plastic that's going in there. Okay, I'm coming along here. I'll offer you a couple of hints. When you're scoring your line, use a piece of sandpaper under your straight edge. That helps hold it, keep it from slipping. And score it multiple times. Get your scoring as deep as you possibly can. That's going to keep you from breaking fibers out when you start chiseling. So do that on both sides. It's really a kind of a scary operation. Keep your chisel under good control. And if you start on the bottom end going upward, you can hold your chisel at an angle so that if it slips, it's not going to go into the part of the guitar that you're not trying to chisel out. So if I stay inside that scoring that I've done, and you don't have to get this as deep as what your piece of plastic is, because you can take some of the excess height off the plastic with a scraper once you get it glued in. But it's a operation that takes a lot of patience. Now, I've done this with a router and a jig. If you're making your own piece to go on here, then you can come up with a jig. There are a bunch of different ways to do it if you look around on the internet. But on this one, I'm just going to go ahead and try to chisel it out and see how good I can do with it. I mean, you want a sharp line delineating your end graft from your wood, of course. I got this end graft glued in using a combination of super glue, and this is basically the same thing as model glue or Duco cement. This particular one is Sure Bonder 9001. I'm going to be using this when I glue the bindings on also. But now I'm going to just take a scraper and scrape that end graft down level, and combination of scraper and some sandpaper, and try to get things looking nice. I've completed the end graft now. I've got it scraped and sanded flush with the side. Our next operation is going to be to install binding, which that's included in your kit as plastic strips. Sometimes a lot of people use wood, but we've got to route out a channel around the perimeter of the guitar body on the top and the bottom to accept this binding. We need to route it out very accurately so the binding fits in there as flush as possible. We'll go back and scrape off any excess to make it flush, but it's a lot easier if you get it done very accurately to begin with. What I'm going to use to cut that channel is a router. Let me see if I can zoom in on this. Using a router bit and a bearing that's going to ride along on the side of the guitar. The size of the bearing is going to control how deeply we penetrate into the side of the guitar, and then the position of the router in its holder is going to control the depth down the side. What we're going to do is once we set it up, we'll make some test cuts and make sure we got the depth and the penetration into the side where we need it to be. I have the guitar sitting in a cradle that I built. It has some rest points along the edges to hold it firmly. They're adjustable for different size guitar bodies. Unfortunately, not easily adjustable. I thought I just took that out of there. Okay. I'm going to use this cradle in conjunction with my router jig here, which I'll explain in a second, to take the guitar body to the router and go completely around the perimeter of the body. The jig I built up here using some drawer slides will allow the router to ride along the top edge of the body, and the bearing that we saw a while ago on the router bit will control the depth into the back in this case as I rotate it around. But first we're going to make a test cut. What I did was just cut off a little tiny piece of the binding so I can use that to check my depth when we cut a test piece. So I'm just going to get a piece of hardwood and check that out now. I'm going to make a test cut in this piece of oak right here and see where we're at, see what we need to do to adjust it. So. Hello. I'm very close. Could maybe cut just a tad deeper. Get here in the camera. I sure could use a cameraman. And as far as how deep we cut into it, that looks very good. I may go just a couple of thousandths deeper. Okay, it took me about 4 attempts to get the depth right. I hope I got it very close. Putting on my dust mask, eye protection, ear protection, and I'm going to have at it. One thing to be careful of is right here where the neck's going to join, you got an opening, and you don't want the bearing on the router to ride down into that opening, so I'm going to skip that area. Very messy operation. Alright, I'm going to take my little test piece of binding and go all the way around and make sure that I got really consistent depth all the way around, that I didn't allow the body to move away from the bearing or anything that would cause a disruption in the channel thickness. Well, I checked the channel in the bottom and it looks good. So it's time to do the top. Put my safety stuff back on. I'm going to go back and check the depth of that and make sure everything went like I hope it did. And then we have to cut another channel for the purfling, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now we have to cut a second channel in the top for a decorative strip that's called purfling. The strip that sits on the sides in a channel is called your binding, and it serves the purpose of protecting the edges and also covering up the joint between your sides and your top, and covering up those braces that are passing through the ends of the braces. Purfling is purely decorative. This type that I'm using on this guitar is wood, and it's called herringbone because of the pattern in it. And it's going to sit inside of the binding. So we've got to cut a channel in the top that is the depth of the thickness of the purfling, and we're going to go into the top using the same setup as before, but with a different size bearing on the router, so that we have the thickness of the binding in conjunction with the width of the purfling. That's how deep we have to cut into the guitar. So I'm going to take my calipers and measure the width of the purfling and the thickness of the binding, and come up with a bearing to put on my router that's going to give me the right amount of penetration into the top. So binding that I'm using is 60 thousandths of an inch. This purfling is 140. So we're talking 200 thousandths, 0.2 inches is how far we want to penetrate into the guitar. And then the thickness of this purfling is 70 thousandths of an inch. So we're going to set the depth of the router to accommodate that. So it's going to take some trial and error, and again, you want to be very careful and trying to get as close as you possibly can, because it's going to save you a lot of work down the road. Hopefully you can see how the router is set up. Again, most important thing before we do this is the router is unplugged. I like my fingers because I like to play instruments. I'm trying to keep them. This is the bearing that was already on there that I used to cut the binding. We're going to need a smaller bearing now because we're going to penetrate further into the guitar. We need to go the depth of the thickness of the binding and the width of the purfling. So we measured those a moment ago, and thickness of the binding 60 thousandths. The width of the purfling is 140, so it's 0.2 inches. I'm going to set my calipers at 0.2 just for reference. Lock them down. And I need to measure, be able to measure from the outside of the bearing to the outside of the cutter and come up with a 0.2. So I know I need a smaller bearing. Can see that I had my router bit very tight. That's important. I can tell you firsthand that it's not a very good thing when the router bit comes loose in the chuck. So had it happen. Actually, I wanted to leave that in there for a minute. Makes it easier to take the bearing on and off. Use an Allen wrench in the end of this to take the bearing off. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here and see which bearing I think I need to give me that. Well, that looks like it's going to give me 200 thousandths. So we're going to put that on there, and then we're going to do some test cuts again. Check the tightness of my collet. All right. Well, I'm ready to start gluing the binding. I'm going to start on the back since that's the easiest. You want to take your chisel and get a good square cut right here, because you're going to be, the bottom binding is going to be visible, all the joint. So you want to get right here where it's perfectly centered on your back stripe. And when we bring it back around the other way, we're going to have to cut it where so it butts up against there just really tightly so nobody can see the joint. One thing I do on the binding is take a scraper and chamfer that inside corner to help it fit in there tighter in case there's any sawdust or anything in the channel. That little chamfered edge will allow it to sit in there tighter in both directions. I'm using Sure Bonder 9001 adhesive, which is basically just like model airplane glue, a model car glue. Since we're working with plastic, we have to use something of that nature. If I was working with wood, I would just use regular white wood glue, a tight bond. Also going to be taping to hold it in place as we go. I'm using a very low tack tape. It doesn't matter so much on a rosewood, but when we start working on the top, it's possible the tape will start pulling the fibers out of the spruce if it's got a lot of adhesion. So I always try to use low tack. What I've got here is an automotive type tape. So I'll get started here. This glue has gotten kind of funky. So here we go, getting centered up. Pull your tape tight in both directions. I use a little extra tape right here in the waist area of the guitar. Like I said, it's tighter radius than anywhere else. So you want to make sure it pulls all the way into that curve. Now here we are on the top side. First thing I'm going to do is cut my purfling joint where the two halves of it have to butt up to one another on the bottom end of the guitar right here. Find out where your waist is, the low point, and see where it wants to sit in the guitar the best. Where the radius of the purfling conforms to the radius of the guitar the best. And then I'm going to work my way around and just temporarily put a piece of tape to hold it there while I cut the joint. Looks like that's where it wants to be. Stick a couple of pieces so it doesn't come loose. And then my other piece, finding where the waist wants to sit. Be about right there, I think. Hold it up tight and bring it around. And I'm going to tape that. Alright, we want our joint to lie on the center of our end graft. So again, I'm going to take my chisel and block. Try to figure out where I want that joint to lie. I want to cut it right on that line. This herringbone purfling will break easily, so don't put too much strain on it. I'm going to cut this piece right there. I want to match a pattern up. Take a look and see how that wants to fit. Oh yeah, it's going to be a good joint. Alright. Now we don't have to join the binding strip. The good thing about the side, if there is one, is that we've got an area up here that's going to be hidden by the neck, so we don't have to be all that careful in this area. With the fretboard extension, it's going to cover up this end. I'm just going to get in the neighborhood and make sure this binding strip is long enough to reach all the way around. Because if we got all the way around and it wasn't long enough, that would be bad. Might make me cuss. It's going to be fine. I'm going to put it in about this position to start. And I'm going to mark that. So I know I got enough on both halves. Don't need this tape anymore. There's going to be a joint. You really cut that square. I'm going to go back and trim that just a tad. So we're going to be gluing the purfling right there. And gluing the binding starting here. My Alright, I think I'm ready to get started. My glue will cooperate. It's gotten stringy or something. Make sure you got glue in both channels. Here's what we ended up with. I'm gonna let that probably sit for at least 2 or 3 hours, maybe all I do today. I'll come back, pull the tape off, and start scraping. Scrape everything flush. Well, there you have it. We've pretty much finished building the box. Just took a tape off after about 2 hours. There's of course a lot of cleanup that needs to be done, mainly with a scraper, and we'll go back and do some sanding. I'm going to let it at least sit overnight before I do any scraping, let that glue get good and hard. But I'll probably go ahead and start working on the neck at this point.